Hello, and welcome back to the Whole Life podcast. My name's Grace Fielding.
And I'm Paul Woolley, and today we're talking about climate. Well, thank you for joining us again. It's great to be with you. How are you today, Grace?
Yes, thanks, Paul. I'm very well today. I feel like this has been a really good season so far, so I'm looking forward to another great guest today.
It has been, hasn't it? I've really enjoyed it. Well, we've got a really interesting subject today, haven't we, Grace? Whether
We do.
it's what we're hearing in the media or what we're seeing with crazy weather patterns across the year, we're all aware that the topic of climate is a big one. We see efforts to combat the climate crisis as we now pay for bags when out shopping, and plastic straws seem a thing of the past, don't they? Today, we're taking a deeper dive into the issue of climate and the environment. More specifically, we'll be exploring how the Christian story might help us frame our understanding of the problem and also the solution.
Well, Paul, as ever, we need some help today, don't we? We are by no means experts on, this topic or any of the topics that we cover in this podcast. But thankfully, we know someone who is an expert when it comes to climate. And we're delighted that she is so kindly joining us on the podcast today. So, Paul, why don't you tell us a bit more about our guest?
It would be my absolute pleasure, Grace. I am delighted that we're joined by Laura Young. Laura is a climate activist, environmental scientist, and ethical influencer. She was recently awarded Scottish Influencer of the Year and is known on social media as Less Waste Laura. As a follower of Jesus, Laura is passionate about raising awareness and catalysing change on environmental issues.
Well, hello, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us on The Whole Life. Where are you joining us from today?
Well, I'm based up in Scotland. I
Yeah.
normally live in Dundee, but I'm actually visiting some family, so I'm calling in from the west coast of Scotland today.
Amazing. Well, we're really delighted to have you. So to kick off, and I'm aware this is kind of a big question to give you at the very start, but could you give us a sense of what the scale of the climate and ecological crisis that we're currently facing is? Maybe for those that, I think we're all aware this is, as Paul said in his intro, a big topic, but maybe you could give us a summary of kind of where we're at the moment.
I mean, big, really big. It's a hard one to explain because on one hand, it is the biggest thing that we, as people, as a planet, have ever faced. But on the other hand, it can often feel distant and far away if you aren't seeing it yourself every
Mm,
single day. It's something that is both ongoing and always there and omnipresent, but also it's something that can happen in an instant. You know, we can have events that really trigger conversations around climate change. So, for really since the Industrial Revolution, we have been changing the way we operate because we have been really using a lot more fossil fuels. We've been industrializing, we've been building infrastructure, building transport, and a lot of that has been using fossil fuels, petrol, diesel, gas, coal. And ever since that moment, we've been changing the way that our planet physically looks and operates. We've been changing the atmosphere, changing the chemical makeup, putting in these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that's the kind of marker of when this all began. That's where we can kind of mark this change happening. But certainly the last few decades, the last 10, 20 years, we've been seeing what we call climate change in our everyday lives.
mhm.
And the way that that looks is very different depending on where you live. So, in places like the UK and Scotland, where I'm based, where you're based, we are seeing extremes of what we normally have. So, we're getting summers that are a lot hotter and a lot drier. We've been sort of peaking, getting to that 40 degrees and seeing that kind of record breaking temperatures every summer. But also, we're getting winters that are a lot wetter, just a lot wetter. We seem to kind of never really get out of the wet cycle.
Yeah.
And so that's how we experience it here. But in other places, it is, extreme drought and no rain at all, or it's extreme, hurricane seasons or just getting stronger and more extreme weather. So it's a huge problem that happens everywhere all the time and it's getting worse. And
Mhm.
that's because we are continuing to, change the makeup of the planet. We are, taking more resources out to make more fuel or to, burn more coal, burn more wood, whatever it might be, and we're changing it. So it's a huge problem. But the funny thing is you could wake up on a day like today and go, I mean, I'm looking outside, where is it? Where is climate change? But on other days, you get, extreme weather events and it's the top of the news agenda and everybody's talking about it because it's been a devastating event. So it's a kind of funny one to try and explain. And certainly some people would say, "Oh, I don't see any climate impacts," but some people that have had their house flooded would say, well, I know exactly what climate
Yeah.
change is. So it's a kind of funny one that it impacts everyone, but it also doesn't. Maybe hopefully that's a good
No, that's
explanation. But
great. That's
you know,
great.
it's one of those things that just intersects with so many issues.
Yeah, you mentioned a bit how obviously people's experience of climate change will be very different depending on where they are based and where they live. So assuming that lots of our listeners are UK based, how do we deal with the kind of the challenge that the UK sort of feels like this this tiny cog in a very small wheel, and that actually our contribution that we can make can feel quite limited, and might even lead people sort of thinking, what's the point when we're compared with countries like China, India, the States, and other kind of bigger economies. How would you suggest that we deal with that kind of attitude?
Yeah, and it's a great question because if you look at, percentages for as an example, if you look at what countries are the biggest contributors to climate
Mm,
change today, you would say, whoa, 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 the UK is way down on the list. There's much bigger, as you've said, economies and countries that need to tackle stuff. But an important thing to recognize is that if you look historically, we've been one of the biggest. We did the Industrial Revolution a lot quicker and a lot faster, a lot sooner. Before everyone else. So we are quite a big historic contributor to what's happening. So there's a point of just acknowledging that and then
mm,
kind of moving forward. There's also a point about where do we get a lot of our stuff, right? So when you look at, as an example, China's emissions, huge chunk of that, over half of their emissions is to do with production, manufacturing, building stuff, making stuff. And where do they ship it? Well, they ship it all around the world to
mm,
us because we buy it
yeah.
off them. So actually, a lot of our emissions, a lot of our contributions actually exist in other countries because we don't really make a lot of the stuff that we use. We don't. So our emissions are actually hidden quite often in other places. So we can have impacts on other countries by changing the way we consume, reducing our
Mm,
consumption. But there's another part which is just geopolitically using our influence. The UK might be a small percentage of current emissions, as an example of talking about it. But actually, geopolitically, we have a lot of influence on how other countries operate. We invest quite heavily in economies around the world, and we can be trying to influence that and changing how we do it, whether that's through energy, oil and gas, whether that's stuff consumption, like I was talking about earlier. So there's a few different ways of doing it. But I think it's just about recognizing that globally, we all contribute to a kind of broad culture and society of consumption, and the way that we operate, and we have a leverage there, and we see that when these big UN summits, United Nations summits on climate happen, and the UK is quite a big influence in that space. We can shift global policy when we talk about this, and so that's a bit of it. But also, it's just important to know that, we can still do stuff here in the UK. We can be shifting things, we can be changing how things operate. And of course, the other side of it is, and we're seeing the impact. So we can also be physically changing how we operate and look to try and mitigate some of that. So there's lots that we can do, but it is a huge point to
mm,
address. But there is a lot that we can do.
Laura, how would you suggest that governments respond to competing pressures? If we think of the situation here in the UK, on the one hand, we've got ambitious climate targets towards net zero, and therefore there's a clear emphasis on trying to tackle the climate crisis. On the other hand, there's a massive issue to do with shortage of housing. In part, that is due to levels of migration into the UK, but other factors as well, including social breakdown. And therefore, we've got this huge plan for housing. An additional, I think, is something like 100,000 a year, maybe even 300,000 a year over the next few years. And of course, that's going to have, potentially a big environmental impact. So, how would you suggest governments respond to those sorts of competing pressures, not least within a global environment where we're obviously all linked to each other. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think partly it's about us not seeing them as competing. Actually, that's one of the problems in politics generally, is that we segment and silo different topics and almost ignore the fact that they often intersect with one another, and they can have knock-on effects, but also they can have co-benefits when we address them. And of course, in a UK context, earlier this year, we had a new government form. And in just the first few days, there was this, we're going to get Britain building. We need more homes, 1.5 million homes in England were sort of pledged in the next 5 years. So we know that that's absolutely something that is on the agenda. But I think the important thing is we need to recognize that we can do these things together. You know, they don't need to be competing. We can create amazing, sustainable homes that are in the right place. So they're not going to get impacted by flooding or drought or cause a lot of pollution nearby. You know, they're going to be in the right place. They're going to be well thought out, well planned. So we're not just going to kind of create these huge unsustainable plots. We're actually going to create thriving spaces, and there's examples, you know, where we have done it well before. We've created new residential areas and nature reserves side by side to kind of bring those co-benefits. But we also need to recognize that if we don't also tackle environmental issues, it's going to have a knock-on effect. So in the UK, 1 in 4 properties is at risk of flooding. So it doesn't
Wow.
really matter how many houses we keep building if we also don't recognise that there's houses at risk of things like flooding and extreme weather. And so earlier this year, London got, it was in the summer, if we can call it the summer, but it got a month's worth of rain in a day. And you just saw across social media and across the media these images and videos of people's houses getting flooded. So if we don't also tackle the existing environmental problems, we're going to need to create even more homes as an example of that, you know, because we're going to have this infrastructure. So I think partly it's about finding that synergy, and it's about finding ways of doing it really well. And housing is the best example because we've just also done a really bad job of making new houses in general. You know, we kind of create these thousands of houses in plots with absolutely no green space, absolutely no amenities, nothing. You're totally reliant on your car, and then that has these knock-on effects. So partly I think that's what we need to do globally as well, is recognize that you can have big need for housing, for healthcare, for transport, for economic growth, if we talk about it in that context. But we also need to see how that links to other things, and see how they have co-benefits. And we've seen it in other spaces as well. One of the big spaces we're seeing it in is health and social care. We're seeing that actually our environment, so not just the green stuff, but actually where we live, what we are surrounded by, has a huge impact on our health, a huge impact on our health. So we can't just be investing in what we prescribe people at the GP. We also need to be looking at where we're sending them back home to, and how we can be improving that physical space to make it better for their health. And so we are doing it. We are getting better at seeing those links. But that is always a challenge. And it's a challenge because of even just logistical things like budgets and how we spend money and how we operate and who's in meetings. But we are getting better. But that's that kind of holistic thinking that absolutely is crucial to not just achieving net zero goals, but actually achieving just better places and systems for people.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you talk about us getting better. At the same time, it seems to me that often we're incredibly short term in our planning. I mean, not only in related to kind of housing, but all sorts of areas in terms of policy, that government policy often seems so short term. So it's designed essentially for the next election rather than the next generation. And I've been struck recently by, well, getting into a little bit of housing. So, in terms of understanding more of this, and I recently having a conversation with some builders who were describing the difference between a lot of houses that are built today compared even with 50 years ago, and saying that often the lifespan of the houses built today is so much shorter. So it feels as if actually we're not building sustainable housing for the long term. It's we're building sustainable housing to get the housing up and kind of deal with an immediate problem as quickly as possible. But even down to things like, for example, they were showing me the difference between the thickness of the wood that is used in roofs and comparing that with, houses that were built previously with today, and just the fact that today the wood is so much thinner. So on the one hand, you think, oh, that's quite a good thing because you're using less to build a house. The problem with that is that you can't then extend a house, so there's no possibility for, say, loft conversions, and it's not going to last in the same way that it did before. So I wonder whether we've still got quite a bit of work to do in terms of trying to think about long-term planning, sustainability. Any thoughts on that, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting as well because some of the concepts that we know will work really well because we've seen it elsewhere around the world. Don't take 5 years. Don't take that political cycle to implement. There's a concept that I've just been loving at the moment is this idea of a 20-minute neighborhood. Other places around the world call it a 15-minute city. And it's just the idea that you wake up, you step outside your front door, and within a 15-20 minute walk, you've roughly got everything you would need for kind of day-to-day life. You've got a pharmacy, you've got a GP, you've got a school, you've got a shop, you've got the basics. And it means we need to change how we plan things. It means we need more green space, we need less big houses on huge plots with nothing but roads. We need more transport links. We need all these different things. But changing that planning infrastructure or getting us to what is a 20-minute neighborhood doesn't take 5 years. It takes 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, because we need to change the whole way that something operates. So, absolutely, we need to be thinking with a lot more long term planning. And another thing that always comes to mind when people talk about this is fossil fuels, okay? Because that is a huge topic. And often net zero, oh, it's so polarizing, okay? It's like the next thing that people just want to disagree on. But net zero, it is an important concept, not just because of the climate impacts, but because let's remember, fossil fuels are a finite resource. Fossil fuels exist around the world in different forms, whether it's coal mines, whether it's gas in rock, whether it's deep under the ocean as these sort of big oil reserves. But these are finite resources, okay? They took, taking you back to school, billions of years to form with dinosaurs and plants dying, sinking to the bottom of the ocean, buried over layers and layers of stuff and turning into fossil fuels. So we know that these resources are going to run out, and they're probably going to run out in the 2050s or 60s. And so there will still be some existing in little pockets, but there'll be so few reserves and it'll become so expensive to extract that basically it won't be viable. So part of the problem that when we talk about net zero, we just talk about emissions, but we don't also talk about that in my lifetime, in most of our lifetimes, these things are going to run out. So we need to also make the transition so that we don't have this hard stop cliff edge that we fall off when we suddenly realize, oh my goodness, we've actually run out of oil and gas. We need to be making this transition to renewables, into green, clean electricity quicker because there is this. So I think partly, yeah, we get lost in thinking about political cycles and thinking about also what's achievable. Sometimes we just like to talk about what's achievable. That's a manageable goal. But we do forget that actually sometimes the best plans take longer, but also that we need to be addressing these problems because there are other factors that are happening in the future, but it's just that kind of after that timeline.
Interesting. Let's talk about the Christian story, Laura, and how that might help us frame our understanding of the problem, but also the solution. How would you go about that? I mean, how would you make the connection between the Christian story and this particular topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a huge question, right? And people have dedicated their whole lives to talking about this and writing about this, and we could never do it justice in a short podcast. However, I guess there's three angles that I take when trying to talk about it. The first is if you just open the Bible, page 1, you stumble into this idea of creation care. We get the creation story. And regardless of how you kind of look at that passage and interpret that passage, it is the story of how everything came to be. And very quickly, we get God's first commandment, which was, can you just look after this? Can you just be responsible? You are a part of my beautiful, amazing creation. And I need you, Adam and Eve, humans, to look after it. So the first angle that we can just take is actually just this creation of which we are a part is something that we need to be responsible for. And if you watch Blue Planet 2 and see all the plastic in the ocean, or you turn on the news and you hear about these kind of extreme climate change impacts, or you look at the way that we're polluting the world, you can just argue that we aren't connected to it. We're not looking after it. We are trashing the planet. So we need to care for it. We need to care for the physical world. And partly that's because it sustains us. And when we don't treat it well, it's really hard to grow things, to grow food, to support ourselves. So that's the kind of first way that I would talk about it, is just this angle of just caring for the world, the creation of which we're a part. The other angle I would talk about is this kind of justice angle, which is when you learn about climate change, when you see flooding, when you see wildfires and droughts and all these kind of impacts, at the heart of it is people. It's people who have lost their homes, lost their livelihood, lost their lives. It's people who are pushed to the kind of margins, pushed into poverty, inequality because of climate change. And justice, because it is an injustice, is obviously at the heart of that conversation. And if you look at the Bible and try and find anything about justice, you're just overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that is in there about how we are supposed to be God's hands and feet on this earth, looking for that ministry of reconciliation, seeking justice, calling out injustice, loving our neighbor. And all of that is wrapped up in climate change, because climate change isn't just a physical thing that happens to the world, icebergs melting, forests burning. It's people at the heart of it. And that is a really crucial thing. And I always think about John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And, we're to love and be a part of that. And when we're asked to love our neighbor, that's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. That's an action. That's go out and do something about it. But I think the third angle is that John 3:16, that one of the things we've done is taken that verse, which is for God so loved the world. That's the kind of classic translation. And we've changed it. We've actually changed it. We've shrunk it. We've shrunk it really, really far. And it was with good intentions. I think that's the caveat. Okay. So in Sunday school, we probably all did that activity where we changed it and we said, so for God so loved, and we would put in our own name, Laura, me, God. And that's because he did. God loved me. God loved me so much that he did this thing where he sent his son Jesus to come to this earth. And we know the rest of the story. But it's important to acknowledge that's not what it said. That it absolutely includes Laura. It includes Laura, my name, your name, Paul, Grace, everybody. But that's not all it said. Actually, it said, for God so loved the world. And the original translation is, for God so loved the cosmos. Literally everything, for as far as we can see and look and imagine, God created it. And God created all of that. And that is at the heart of the gospel. That's at the heart of what we are all about as Christians, is not that it stops with just me or with just you, but actually it's all of creation. That is what the gospel is. It goes beyond what we have shrunk it down to. And so it's about opening up and seeing that. So these are the kind of three ways that we can think about it and talk about it. And they're not separate. They are, of course, completely and utterly linked. But these are three different things that are hidden within the Bible, or we've hidden them in the Bible because we've changed the narrative a little bit. We've removed ourselves from creation. We see creation as the planet and we are separate from it. And that's not the case. We see climate change as a physical, environmental thing rather than an injustice that actually is impacting people. And we've shrunk the gospel and we've taken out the world and creation. We've removed all that cosmos and just put in people. And that's not what it says. It's about looking at it fresh. And I think when you suddenly kind of come at it from these angles, you reorientate and you look through these lenses, you kind of can't ignore it. But also, I don't know, it gives you the permission to also see this as a form of worship. Actually, doing stuff about climate change is not just a good thing because it's good to be eco. Actually, it's a godly thing and it's what we've been called to do. And I love the almost permission that it gives you to accept that. And it's no longer this polarizing issue that we all need to be, because actually it's something that unites us and is part of the Bible. And that's how I would begin to try and unpick it. But of course, there's so much more than that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. It's so refreshing to hear you speak like that. I have to say, Laura, that when I asked you the question, I expected the first bit of your answer, and and rightly, you've drawn our attention back to creation and the emphasis there on stewarding the earth and looking after it as God's representative and seeing it flourish. But the fact that then you went on to talk both about justice and then also to talk about the work of God in Christ on the cross, the atoning work of Jesus, I think often is missed out. And I think you're absolutely right that often we have reduced our theology of atonement essentially to individuals. So the
Yeah.
world becomes the sum total of individuals
Mm.
that God is committed to and loves, rather than the fact that these individuals are part and parcel of this a bigger cosmos that God has both created to, but is also committed to in terms of the reconciling all things to Himself through Christ. So I think it's such a helpful emphasis, but equally it's also one that often is missed out. And as you were speaking as well, I was reminded of the fact that I used to work for Bible Society, and when I was there, we produced a new Bible edition, which was called the Poverty and Justice Bible. And the idea of that Bible was that every verse that related to justice was highlighted. I mean, literally in a
Mm.
pink highlighter pen. And what was so extraordinary about that, which won't surprise you really, but was when you then looked at the Bible that was produced, it was very difficult to find anything that wasn't highlighted. And it just drew attention to the fact that a thread that runs through all of Scripture is God's commitment to justice. And that is such a dominant theme, and yet often is one perhaps that we also neglect. So interesting. Let me just talk to you a little bit. I want to provoke you just a little bit, if I may.
You got a warning there.
So this is just around the creation part. And I suppose one of my reflections is that people, I think, are quite open to being told that there are limits on our use of the planet, so that we don't have complete autonomy when it comes to our use of the planet. We have responsibilities to the planet. But those same people can get a bit cross if there's ever a suggestion made that we might also have limits on how we use ourselves, how we use our bodies, how we relate to one another. And yet we are part and parcel of this creation that God has put together. And I just wonder whether that is because it's easier for us to distance ourselves from our responsibilities to the planet and to tackling the climate and the ecological crisis. Whereas when it comes to, if you like, ourselves, well, that's kind of much closer, and we don't like any suggestions that there are any limits on that. What do you think about that?
Mm, that's a very good question, a deep thought. I mean, I, I think it's an interesting one because I think if we, as humans, if we could distance ourselves from our bodies, we probably would, right? Like
Mm.
or we would probably change lots of things. We just can't because we are physically trapped. I can't get my brain out of my body. Um, I think I also want to reflect on sometimes when you read, particularly the Old Testament, there are some fantastic passages about the land, about physical land, about how we treat it, how we tend it, how we give it fallow time. I guess I'm thinking about Jubilee. That's something that kind of comes to mind. Giving the land rest, understanding the rest, connection to it. You can then also jump to a lot of the parables, what Jesus is teaching that talk about land, talk about the world, or even just some of the kind of common things that we talk about. We talk about mustard seeds, we talk about the vine, we talk about all of these physical earth creation stories. Okay, that's often how we learn. But today, you could go a few days in a row, a few weeks in a row without physically going outside and touching any grass. Okay, we live
Yeah.
in homes that are bricks and mortar. Some of us might not walk that often, so we're in cars, we're on bikes, we're on trains. When was the last time you touched something natural? And then go further. When was the last time you farmed anything? Okay, I tried farming in lockdown. I was a bit of a COVID lockdown gardener. Tried to grow some cucumbers and potatoes and all sorts. And at that time, trying to grow something from my not very sunny garden in Glasgow was probably the biggest time that I started to understand these stories about the land, about the soil, about creation. And I think that's partly because we have lost that connection over time because back when the Bible was written, we were all farmers, right? We lived off the land, we understood it, whereas now we don't. And I think that is part of where that disconnection has come from. And actually, it's been easy to separate ourselves from creation because we're never in it. And what I mean by that is we sit in houses and offices and like it might be nice to look at a tree, but actually we don't spend time in it. and we also don't work the land anymore. And I think that that plays into what you were talking about. Hopefully that's a helpful
Hmm.
thing to think about. But I do believe that it's just easy to separate ourselves, whereas it is really difficult to separate ourselves from our physical bodies. But we probably would want to if we could. But I
Mm.
guess that's where my brain goes to. And I think that also plays into where our theology got a bit off track, and where our interpretation of this stuff and where that separation came from, was just because we are physically, you know, removed from the world.
Yeah, interesting. Great answer, Laura. Let's just talk a little bit about eschatology. So it's not the end of the world. Yes, it is. No. So that is to say that I wonder to what extent the way people respond to these issues is related to their eschatology. In other words, if we believe that the world as it is going to be destroyed and that's just the end of the matter, then that probably is going to have some impact on the way we relate to the world in the present. If, on the other hand, we have a view of the world that God is at work and we've got an ultimate vision in a renewed creation, a new heaven and a new earth, and also a vision actually of resurrection, that we will be physically or have some renewed physicality, shall we say, in the future, that might change things. What do you think about that? Do you think that's true or not?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think partly this is also related to where all of this kind of disconnect to creation. What we've been talking about already, you know, that idea that we're separate and it's nothing to do with us, and everything's going to be okay because we're getting this new place. And I guess there's a few ways that I address it, but I think ultimately I try and use real day examples rather than getting lost in the theology, and that I guess that's just how my brain works. I remember actually when LICC launched the Wisdom Lab of Everyday Earthkeeping, we got a question around this, and people can go to that resource and see me probably answer it a better way on the night. But you know, it was this idea, and it was funny because I sort of said, I don't know why, but the thing that's jumped into my head is when I was a teenager and my parents went away on a holiday and I had a house party, right?
Oh
So it's not
dear.
my house. The house will be fine. But I remember thinking, I need to keep this place in order because this is not mine. This is my parents'
Mm.
house. They trusted me when they went away, and it, you know, I should respect them and love them and make sure that I clean up after this party is over. And I remember feeling a bit like a custodian, you know, and it's a silly example,
No,
but
it's a
it's
Good
an
good
example.
example
example.
of, you know, I didn't just let everything go to rack and ruin because guess what? It's just a house. It's not coming with us. Everything can be replaced. It was about respect and love for my parents and wanting
Mm.
to ensure that that place was respected. And the other example I always talk to people about is I say, okay, well, fair enough. You know, if you're coming at this angle, which is the physical world doesn't matter, it's not coming with us, it's going to get burned up, folded up, whatever you want to kind of use as a phrase. I then ask them about their bodies. I say, okay, right, so let's talk about your physical self. Say we go out on a wee hill walk and you fall over, and oh my goodness, God forbid, you break your leg. Am I going to go, oh, well, that's all right because your physical body, it's not coming with us. Actually, you're going to get, no, of course not. I'm going to say, right, let's get onto mountain rescue. Let's get you to a hospital. Let's fix up your leg. Let's make sure we mend it. Let's use the amazing science and medicine that God's given us to fix it, because we need to respect, this is the body that God's created for us, we're to respect it, this is our home, we're to, you know, give it love and dignity. And so I think sometimes it's also just about framing it slightly differently, which is we would never think to leave somebody in pain or hurt or harm with their physical body if we could help it, yet we're okay to do it with other bits of creation. And I think also, I guess I would just kind of move people on with what we were talking about before, which is, I know this is kind of talking about the ends and what's going to happen after, but I would say, okay, fair enough. The three arguments that I would give about climate and justice, you can maybe ignore the first one if you've got that idea that creation care is important. But what about the second one? What about this idea that actually this is about justice as well? It's about people. Can you still ignore what's happening to the planet when you know it's impacting people? And I would sort of let them sit with that. And I would also talk about what we mentioned about the gospel, about this reconciliation of all things. How does that play out? And I think partly it's about just questioning and actually saying, discussing this and talking about this and acting about this doesn't take away from anything else. It actually adds to, it
Mm.
enhances. And I think it's just about reframing it. But it's always a hard one. And I think partly it's just because that's the mindset the church has been in for so long. And it's about challenging it and changing it, which isn't always easy because it can be quite a deep rooted thing.
That's
Yeah.
really helpful illustration, Laura. And matter really does matter. I suppose that's the point,
Yeah.
isn't it? Let me just provoke you the other way, just briefly, if I may, which is around neo-paganism. So I want to suggest that it's interesting that a lot of those who are most energetic or exercised about the climate and ecological crisis are also those that actually might not have the outlook that you've just described, might not have that theology or eschatology, might not have a commitment to the idea of resurrection. In fact, you could argue that they're kind of Platonists. They basically have this view that kind of the world is all that there is, and therefore that becomes the kind of the motivating factor for them. Is there a danger of us all becoming neo-paganisms in this, in the sense of worshipping, if you like, that which God has created rather than God as creator?
Yeah, really so important, and that's definitely a criticism, that I've heard before, and that I see play out. I also see it being used as a hesitation to engage in this because there's a worry that you might fall down a rabbit hole and be lost. And I think there is that important thing that, often if somebody says, when do you feel closest to God, I often talk about when I'm outside, standing on some of the beautiful mountaintops in Scotland and just looking out and just feeling absolutely awestruck by what God has created. But it's important that that distinction is made, that I am not looking going, I am in love with this landscape and this landscape in and of itself as an entity, but actually I'm looking out saying, I love this because God has created it, and what a creative creator, and he's, made this for us to be a part of. And I think it is important to make that distinction. Um, but I also see that it's an important group to be engaging with, okay? And I guess I'm taken back to when COP26, the United Nations Climate Summit, came to Glasgow back in 2021. And there was a huge missional opportunity for churches to be engaging with people who were in this space, who were engaged in climate conversations and sustainability, to be the people that talk about the link between faith and climate and God and creation. And I think that is an open door because, absolutely, I think in the same way that we have got a little bit lost with our theology, removing all of this, we can also get lost the other way and almost lose God. And it's important that we find that balance. And that's not, that's a struggle. It is a struggle to do that. It is easy to fall in love with the planet and the physical world and forget about who created it. So it's finding that balance, and it's working both ways. And I think that's an important thing. And I love churches that wrestle with this and actually talk about it regularly and say, we want to talk about this in all of its in roundness and holistically, because we don't want to go either way, but we recognize that there's a pull both ways. So let's navigate that together.
Laura, I love that. It's so helpful to have heard some of the really real examples that you've given in thinking about some of this stuff. I feel like the house party one will definitely stick with me as a really great analogy. I won't ask, how the house ended up at the end of the party, but I'm sure with you taking care of it, it sounds like it would have been absolutely fine. We thought about the Christian story and some of the kind of the bigger ideas that we see throughout the Bible and how we can apply that to how we can think about this topic of climate. But I wondered, for you personally, obviously we mentioned in your intro that you do all sorts of environmental work and kind of activity around this stuff. But how do you kind of integrate having a Christian faith with environmental work and activism?
Yeah, I mean, originally I didn't. And I think that's partly because I grew up in a church that didn't talk about the environment or climate or that kind of stuff in terms of the justice or anything. And it wasn't that they were against it, it's just that they didn't talk about it. And I think that's the story of a lot of churches. It's just not on the radar. It's a bit of a fringe activity or topic. So growing up, I had a faith, but I didn't link that to what I worked in. So I went and studied geography and environmental science. I stepped into that world, and my two things were quite separate. And partly that's because my own theology was this narrow: the gospel is about me, creation is just a lovely thing that God created, and we get to live in it, and that's just fantastic. But guess what? It's not coming with us. And I guess my work was just driven by wanting to do something good. It was just like, this seems to be a problem. Let's try and do something about it. Here's my skills. However, I went on a journey kind of coming out of that university and actually going, God, there must be something in the Bible about this. There just must be. This is too big an issue that impacts too many people, that the Bible surely says something about it. And the kind of long story short is I went on a real wrestling journey with my minister at the time, with myself, with different Christian organizations like Tear Fund who were working in this space, to actually say, what does the Bible say? What does this mean to be a Christian in this space? Is it just that this is a nice thing that God's called me to, and it's just a lovely extra piece of work, or is this vital and actually part of it? And obviously the outcome of that was realizing that there was all this theology and all this scripture about what it means to be working in this space. And now I am driven by God's call on me personally and on the church to do something about it. And I see God at work through the research that I do as part of my PhD, through the campaigning stuff that I do. And day to day, that God is in it. And that sometimes looks like just having prayer at the heart of a campaign that I do, even if it feels a bit random, in terms of, like, I did a lot of campaigning around disposable vapes and technology waste. Like, that's definitely not in the Bible, but actually prayer and bringing God into the heart of it was crucial. And I think that's what it looks like today, and that is obviously very, very different. And I also now have the church as part of my work, trying to engage with the church and other Christians. And before that wasn't really anything on my radar. Maybe a church eco group might get in touch, and that was quite a sweet thing. But now, obviously, that's at the heart of the work that I do.
Yeah, I think I was quite surprised to hear when you said that you didn't previously necessarily integrate the two together, because the way you speak about it now is as if they are so intertwined, and almost the way you present it is difficult to separate the two of them. So an amazing example to all of us, in the sense of I know you spoke about sort of wrestling and looking, taking that initiative to look into, where can I find God in this, because I know he's there, which I think is very inspirational. You mentioned some of the research, or like the previous research and projects and campaigns you've done. Can you share any that are kind of recent, that you find kind of particularly promising or groundbreaking? I know sometimes with this area we can all feel quite hopeless, and as if everything we're doing is just leading us in a very negative direction. But what have you been working on that you actually feel kind of quite hopeful for?
Yeah. I mean, so the random one that I mentioned earlier was about disposable vapes, and that is
Yeah.
so niche and so small. But actually, I led a campaign for around 18 months around this issue of disposable vapes, which are technology, but they're also a kind of health, there's a health aspect to them as well. A lot of young people picking this up as a habit. And we did a whole bunch of campaigning around that. And the thing that came out of it that was really positive is that it kind of threw into the spotlight consumption, materials, disposability, and really gave us another kind of oomph and an amount of momentum to talk about: we live on a planet with finite resources. We need to be using our materials really wisely and really well. And we kind of talked about it through this lens and had some kind of great government investment and, just real enthusiasm for what we're talking about. There's also been campaigns that I've been involved in that have just felt like you feel like playing your little part has a really big impact. So in Scotland, we were one of the first countries to ban single-use plastic cotton buds. And that was a
Okay.
huge victory because they're just such a nuisance and so pointless, and we're causing a lot of pollution. But one of the things that I do is I'm a volunteer for the Marine Conservation Society, and we would go on these little beach cleans, and you were given a sheet and you were tallying off everything you found. So you were data collecting as you were going: how many wet wipes, how many packets of crisps, how many this, that. And all of that data got used to actually influence the government to change the law. And you suddenly felt like, All those little
Mm,
beach cleans that I went on and tallied every single thing that I found actually made a difference.
yeah.
And there's also global things that happen that are just huge, and you are a very small part of it. The big COP conferences that happen around climate are the kind of biggest example. And there's been decades of campaigning to get things like the Loss and Damage Fund. So that is a big climate fund where big polluting countries contribute finance to help countries that are, it's kind of in the name, experience loss and damage because of climate impacts. And this fund, after decades of campaigning, has been established, has been set up, money is now being pledged. So we're getting kind of millions of pounds or millions of dollars to countries who are experiencing some of the worst in terms of climate impacts. And that feels really positive to have got to that stage and to know that there are now, really concrete, substantial support systems there for these countries. And when I worked for Tier Fund, we were kind of part of that campaigning alongside, thousands, millions of other people. So you get these kind of big wins that happen globally where you think that was a huge hurdle, but we've now got something going. And then you also get really local examples where you think that was just a total win to be able to get that happening on a local scale and be able to shape that. So there's been countless things, that I've been involved in that give you that winning feeling that you think we're actually moving, we've got momentum.
Yeah.
And we don't often talk about them enough. That's definitely something I recognise. We
Mm,
often moan about the stuff that's not going right, but there is a lot of stuff that has happened previously that's
yeah.
been really encouraging.
Yeah, I think that's such a helpful thing to hear as well, in the sense of, obviously, spoke at the start, didn't we, about sometimes feeling like such a tiny cog.
Yeah.
But actually, they're brilliant examples of how, sometimes actually doing a small thing can lead to really big impact. And so I suppose to kind of ground lots of this, and I think, I know you've mentioned various different things that, and I think the whole kind of tone of this podcast has been, there are things we can do to help the environment. What would you say are kind of the most critical actions that individuals or people listening to this could take to combat climate change? So we're thinking about, practical steps in kind of our daily life and work. What would be the kind of top ones that you would call people to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just put in a bundle. There's like
Great.
lifestyle action, right? Because it's still important. Okay. Don't knock it. Still try and reduce your consumption, try and reduce your waste, delete your Amazon account, stop buying fast fashion. Like all that gets bundled into just try every day to make little choices that are better.
Mm,
And I don't want to put too much emphasis on those because if everybody does that, if a few people do that perfectly, we're still going to be in a bit of a mess. But I think it's important that as a society, we try and shift culture by making these everyday changes. However, I think the big thing that I would want people to be left with is actually seeing where they can have the most influence. So the classic example is like my church used to use plastic cups, and we worked out we used about 10,000 plastic cups every single year. Now I could turn up to church with my reusable cup to get my coffee in after the service, and that would save 52 cups a year. Or I could just get in touch with the church team and talk to the tea and coffee ladies and say, how do we feel about switching back to just mugs and
old
encourage people to
school.
bring their own, ease the wash up. And that's what we did. So we saved 10,000 in a year. Okay.
Wow.
So part of it is about seeing where you can have the most influence. And for people who are in workplaces, that is one of the big places where we can have change. We might work for big companies that in terms of their procurement, have huge impacts, or their energy or their transportation fleet. There's huge things that we could do. So, that might be trying to encourage your workplace to have a no fly policy within the UK, just use trains and public transport. It could be looking at your banking and your pensions and seeing if you can divest them away from not just fossil fuels, but things like arms trades and tobacco and gambling. There's a whole host of things that we can be divesting from. So there's ways that we can have influence beyond just making individual life changes. And I think that's where I would be looking for people to be seeing where they have that influence. When I started my research, joined a university, it was a whole new institution. And I am now on a journey with them to think about their sustainability. And that's more than I could ever do on my own, but that's working with a big institution. And I think that, is absolutely key. And I think also just getting people to pray about it. This is something that we need to
Mm,
wrestle with. And, if you maybe if you were hesitant, you didn't listen to this podcast. So maybe we're only talking to the eco people by the end of it. But if you've listened to what we've talked about and it doesn't sit well with you, like it makes you feel uncomfortable and you think, I don't believe that, or I think that's the wrong way to interpret the Bible, or I'm not on board with this net zero stuff, I hate low emission zones, whatever you're feeling, okay, pray about it, sit with it, because actually that's okay to have those feelings, but hopefully when provided with new information, we can all have our hearts opened to this issue. And I've changed my mind on this issue. I think one of the most powerful things we can all do is change our mind about things when we're presented with new information. So I would just ask people to kind of sit with it, to wrestle with it, to see if their perspective can be opened or changed, or just have time with it, because that's something that I think we can all do a bit more on lots of different topics. So that would probably be the one I would leave people with.
And Laura, you've talked there about having changed your mind. Can you recommend to us some resources, some books perhaps, that have influenced you in your journey and helping you change your mind and integrate these things?
Yeah. I mean, this year there was the LICC Wisdom Lab, Everyday Earthkeeping. So that is a fresh resource, not just plugging it because you're
Very good, Laura.
LICC and I'm in it.
Well done.
We
But
haven't
that's a
paid her
good
to
one.
do that.
No, I know. I'll send my invoice after this. But yeah, I think that's a really key thing, is actually looking at that one, and it's kind of discussions and it's short essay pieces. And there is also Paul, who is one of the contributors, also wrote a longer piece called Jesus Saved to Die the Planet. And if you hear that title and go, like that doesn't sit well with me, great. That's a great starting point. I think there's also lots of other, books and recommendations. You've got John Stott on creation care, which is obviously a kind of compilation of works that you can kind of look at and reflect on. There's different organizations who do work in this space. You've got Tear Fund, you've got Christian Aid, you've got Arosha, who all kind of talk about this and have different videos, resources, things to kind of wrestle with. And I think there's one resource that I found really helpful, and it's another one that I'm in, sorry, plugging it. But I did something with Tear Fund, and it was 5 climate conversations. And the idea was I sat down with 5 different organizations, so one person each from a different organization, and we talked about climate change. And it wasn't prescribed, the agenda was not set, but the purpose was, let's have a conversation about climate change and see, does it intersect with your work? Because as Tear Fund, it obviously intersected with everything we were doing. But these different organizations, we were like, let's have a conversation and see. And the organizations were Alpha, International Justice Mission, Christians Against Poverty, the Evangelical Alliance, and the Bible Society. And we just sat down and said, here we go, let's talk about it and let's see what comes out of it. And I was very ready for all of them to go, this is a total fringe subject, nothing to do with us, and it's nice that you're covering it, but we're not. And spoiler alert, that's not the case. That's not what came out of these conversations. So those are interesting if you either heard one of those organizations and thought, oh, I love their work, I want to hear what they have to say, or if you're just interested in hearing about how climate intersects with different issues. And that those are great kind of video resources that you can go and watch. But there's tons of stuff. You've got Ruth Valerio, you've got Catherine Hayhoe, who's a Christian climate scientist. Again, there's these kind of people who come out and just, speak so greatly about it. So there's loads of stuff that's out there. And if you find my essay that I did as part of the Wisdom Lab, I have more references, so you can also go and kind of pull out some from there.
Well, that's great, Laura. And we can do that by going on to the LICC website, which is licc.org.uk. But Laura, tell us, how can we keep track of you? Not least, you're doing your PhD and you're doing all sorts of things. So how do we do that? How do we keep up with what you're up to?
Yeah, the easiest way is I exist on all social media as Less Waste Laura. So you can find me, follow me, and see what I'm up to. I'm normally having a rant about something, or hopefully being positive as well about other things, but you can find all my work there. And I do have a website, lesswastelaura.com, and I keep that pretty up to date. And if you want to deep dive into what my studies are and all that, that's where you'll find it as well.
That's the place to go. Well, I will have a look at that and keep track on that. Laura, it's been so good speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time, which you've been generous with. And we've really enjoyed the conversation, haven't we, Grace?
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thanks you, Laura. Goodbye. Well, that was great, wasn't it? Great.
Brilliant.
What did you think of Laura?
I thought Laura was excellent. I think it made me smile how she kind of referred to herself as being somebody that you might usually find kind of ranting about some sort of topic. on her various social media platforms, when actually I think my impression of her was clearly that she's very passionate about this stuff, but actually is that she's very kind of pragmatic and trying to think in, what can we do rather than what a disaster uh,
Yes.
climate is. And I think, yeah, the examples that she gave of whether it's projects that she's worked on, I have to say one of the questions I did have was, I wonder what she spoke about single-use cotton buds, didn't she? And I feel like after this, I'm going to have to Google what a non-single-use cotton bud is and how that works. Yeah, I was sort of thinking I'm not going to get too far down that rabbit hole, but that was a great example, wasn't it? If she's obviously looking in some ways what we might deem as kind of small spaces, whether it was disposable vapes or cotton buds, but thinking about these areas that maybe we haven't thought of as being huge contributors to consumerism and things like that. Also was really struck by when we asked her the question about the Christian story, and she gave the three examples of the approach. One of which, as you said, was kind of creation, which I think most of us would probably expect. But I think especially the one about the John 3:16 verse, which I just thought was a really brilliant example of. I think she's absolutely right. We so often make that human centric verse, and of course humans are part of the world, but actually just bringing it, she spoke about it, didn't she, is actually the word that's used for world is the whole cosmos. And I think yeah, I'm still sort of surprised that when she first started in this area, when she did her degree and things, actually her faith and her work were very separate. Because you would never get that sense from her today, would you? Because she speaks with, she's clearly hugely knowledgeable about this stuff, as you'd expect. But also, her faith, she speaks so naturally about how she's sort of linked her faith to that. So yeah, I feel inspired. I feel challenged to get my reusable coffee cup out again, because I have to say I feel like after COVID they were sort of seen as a bit, I feel like I was always a regular in the coffee shop. Well, full stop, but also with my reusable coffee cup. And then I feel like when COVID happened, everyone was a bit like, oh, you can't bring this back. And again, I know it's a small thing, but it made me think actually that's something that is an easy way of starting to do my bit again. And then yeah, I'll Google the reusable cotton buds and decide
Yes,
whether
well,
I
let
feel like
us
they
know.
work.
Let us know, Grace.
How about you though, Paul? I'm sure you've got
Wow.
some much
No,
more profound
no, no,
thoughts.
no, no. I mean, that can be your prophetic act, your reusable coffee cup. I suppose that is part of the point, isn't it? That some of these things actually don't make a big difference, but in a sense, it's a statement of intent. And
Mm,
also, it's something around, trying to take seriously our waste culture and our kind of disposable culture, which is a good thing to address. I mean, landfills are a massive issue for us. I agree with you, Grace. I thought Laura's very measured, isn't she? And
yes.
winsome. And I think that's a very kind of attractive approach, isn't it? And helpful. I thought, as you referenced, the house party analogy is a really good one,
Mm,
and has stuck with me. And I thought that threefold emphasis of the Christian story, starting with creation, but then also including that emphasis on justice. We've talked before about if we're serious about loving God and loving our neighbours as ourselves, that necessitates, for example, political engagement. Well, similarly, it necessitates concern for the environment and trying to
mm,
tackle the climate and ecological crisis. But then again, I think centering a lot of this agenda in the work of God in Christ on the cross is really helpful, and is something that is often neglected. I think there is part of what Laura gives, which is sort of plays to, that kind of tendency, that I have, Grace, of wanting to go back in time and essentially live
yeah.
in kind of the same village as Miss Marple, and the
Your
sort of
20
sense.
minute neighborhood.
Exactly. And the
Yeah.
thing is, in a way, part of me thinks, well, those 15, 20-minute neighborhoods, that is kind of how we used to live. And
Mm,
actually, to some extent, that's kind of how we live today, in terms of if you're not in certain settings. I mean, you could argue actually that the most urban settings are the most like the 15, 20-minute neighborhood. But, where I live, which is a slightly more rural kind of setting, that still is true. And I sort of think there is something that we have had historically, certainly in our recent past, that it would be good to recover,
Yeah.
which is around attachment to community, attachment and relationship to the land, and also then to each other. Something about kind of, taking place seriously, and the physical environment in which we live seriously. I suppose also, though, as I say that, I recognise that that's a privilege, and
Yeah.
the reality is there are plenty of us that just don't have access to that sort of space. And your reference to the pandemic's interesting, because I just think your experience of the pandemic, depending on who you are and where you were, just made such a difference, doesn't it? I mean, there's a difference from that experience if you were in a place that you have access to green spaces, open places, or
Mm.
if you were in a high-rise tower block and confined to that space, a very different kind of experience of essentially the same event. And of course, one of the things I think that Laura said that's helpful is how this issue around climate isn't detached from everything else. It's part and
Mm.
parcel of it all. And
Mm.
that's kind of helpful too, I thought.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think yeah, I think she brought fresh perspective, but also good reminders of things that maybe we have thought about, but either have gone on the back burner, or um yeah, we just frankly feel a bit hopeless, and what difference does my contribution make? But I feel like she kind of called us again today. So well, if you enjoyed this episode of The Whole Life, as ever, we'd love you to give us a follow, leave a review, and let your friends know about it. But until next time, from Paul and I, that was The Whole Life. Goodbye, everyone, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode.
Goodbye, everyone.